Thank you very much, Andres. That was far too generous. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí, Puebla. It's very pleased to be here. Now, I've only got 20 minutes to talk about thinking and thought, so don't clap. I've only got 20 minutes. Now, there are many things I could say, but there's only one thing I think I can do, and that is I can reason with you. Oh, well, that's not technically true. There are other things I could do, I suppose. One thing I could do is that if I were very eloquent, I had a wonderful command of the English language, I could just sort of say beautiful words and wonderful things, but empty words, but I could leave you believing you'd heard something profound. I think there are some people who can do that. I won't name them. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to do that even if I wanted to. Another thing I could do, though, which perhaps is more common, is that I could use various tricks of rhetoric and so forth. I could present to you things which looked like and seemed like good arguments, and things which persuaded you, but I wouldn't be using good reasoning. I would just be using these rhetorical devices. And a lot of people do that deliberately. Other people do it accidentally, actually. A lot of people sincerely believe they're giving good arguments, when really they're just engaged in rhetoric. Now, I think if you thought I was doing either of those two things, you'd be deeply unimpressed. I think what you want me to do, if I am to persuade you of any ideas I have, is to reason with you, to give you a rational argument. And I'm going to be using the terms of reason and rationality in a very general sense. Some people might say there's a difference between reason and rationality. I'm just going to use them in this general way, and by the end, I hope you'll understand why it is that general way is sufficient. But I say it should be obvious that this is what I'm going to do, that it's the only thing I could do. But if you think about it, these ideas of reason and rationality have become deeply contested over recent decades, really. There's no longer an assumption that we all share this capacity to reason. And I think the very idea of reason has been introduced on two sides, by both attackers and actually by some defenders. Let's think about some of the attackers first. We hear various things said about why reason is not something to be trusted, it's not all it's cracked up to be. People claim, for example, that what people claim as a universal reason, a rationality which arrives at truth for all, is actually only, say, a Western construct. Or people even say it's a masculine construct. Okay, it's not universal at all. And therefore, we need to dismiss it. It's just an imperialistic thing. Other people say that rationality is a kind of veneer, that what really lies at the basis of our beliefs are things like desires and our personalities. We believe what we want to believe, we believe what we're disposed to believe, and we just give rational arguments over the top of them to make them look intellectually respectable. And other people say the problem with reason is not so much that it's a bad thing, but it crowds out other things which are as valuable or maybe more value. So it's not just love, but things like creativity, intuition, and faith, which have reasons of which reason knows nothing. Now, all these criticisms of reason, I think they all have something in them, but what should be obvious is that none of them succeed remotely in debunking reason. And the reason for that is that in order to say why reason is limited, to say why it's not good, why it doesn't work properly, what can you do? The only thing you can do is actually use reason itself. You use reason to critique reason. And this is, in fact, a very important feature of reason when it's used properly. Reason has to be properly reflexive. It needs to be able to look at itself. We need to be able to use reason to criticize ourselves, not just positions out there. So if you look at all those criticisms of reason I've explained, actually, what they turn out to be is they turn out to be criticisms of reason being misused, not being properly reflexive and self-critical. So the idea, for example, that reason is a Western construct is really, if people took that idea very seriously, then they would be saying that that means that non-Westerners are irrational, right? If rationality is Western, then people not from the West are irrational. Or if rationality is masculine, then women are irrational. People don't actually say that, because that's not what they believe, of course. What they believe is that in the West, there is a certain narrow, excessively narrow conception of what it means to be rational, and that is too limited. But in order to make that criticism, of course, you have to be using reason. You can't, if you just said, I think reason is a Western construct, and you say, well, why? you say, what I just do, no one would be persuaded by that. The reason why we have serious academic discussions and books on these subjects is because people can reason why they think reason is failing. And the same goes for the other criticisms I've said. Now, actually, this is a very important lesson because it is important to listen to these criticisms. It is important to appreciate the limits of reason. It's very, very important, for example, that we pay attention to what psychology tells us about how it is actually the case that often we don't believe what we believe for good, rational reasons, but because of our emotions and so forth. It's very important we do that. But the greatest proponents of rationality and reason in history, all the great philosophers, they've always known about the limits of reason. They've always made it obvious, and they've always operated within them. One of the most famous quotes, Socrates, saying the only thing he knows is that he knows nothing. Favorite quote of mine from Aristotle, which is that it is the mark of the trained mind never to expect more precision than the subject matter allows. Everyone has always known about this, which is why I think there's a problem with the way in which reason is sometimes defended now. There are some people who see themselves as the holders of the torch of the Enlightenment. They champion reason, they claim it for themselves. But the problem is that the idea of reason they have often turns out to be too narrow. So just as those who criticize reason make reason too small by denying its power, some of the defenders of reason make reason too small by making it something that only a kind of a select few actually use and can have. I can give some examples here. I'm an atheist, and a lot of secular humanists adopt the label of rationalist. They describe themselves as rationalists. Now, that's a perfectly good aspiration. I think we should aspire to be rational in what we believe most fundamentally about the world. But for some, and only some of this group of people, having conceived of themselves as the rationalists, they therefore think that anyone who takes a different worldview is clearly therefore an irrationalist or non-rational in some way. They are making reason too specific to their beliefs. I'll explain why in a minute. I think there's a similar problem with people who try and equate being rational with being scientific. Now, of course, science is, I think, one of the greatest achievements of rational thought and the most successful. It's the thing which gives us hardest results, I think. But at the same time, it's just not true that I exhaust what rationality is. It is possible, for example, to think rationally about ethics without having to think in a narrowly scientific way. And yet there are people who would claim that the only proper way to study ethics and morality is in a scientific manner. So we have to look at what evolution tells us about altruism and so forth. These are important things. We should know about them, but that's not all that rationality is. So why is it then that, as I'm claiming, some people make the idea of rationality too small? They make it something that only people who take their specific worldview have. Well, I think it's a result partly of an ambiguity in the very word itself, what it means to be rational. Sometimes we describe something as rational, and we're talking about the end product. We're talking about the conclusion. So, for example, if we're having an argument about whether or not God exists, if you believe that reason leads you to the conclusion that God does not exist, that is the rational conclusion. Then the belief that God does exist is not rational. There's another sense of reason, though, which is to do with the process at which we arrive at that. And it seems to me that that is a much more shared thing. People arrive at different conclusions about what is rational, but they're fundamentally using the same kind of process. They're thinking things through in more or less the same way. And I think it's really very important that we remember that that conception of reason as a process, rationality as a process, is something that we are almost all engaged with, irrespective of what our conclusions are. Because if you think about it, if you think about the use of rational as applied to conclusions, this is the rational thing to believe. A lot of the time, it's actually not clear, or it's certainly not absolutely sure what is rational or is not in a particular occasion. We've heard Jerry Coyne talk about evolution. In that case, sure, the evidence is overwhelming. The rational thing to believe there is that evolution is a fact. okay? And it's not rational to believe other things. But in many other things, there's much, much more room for disagreement about the things that I think philosophy still struggles with most, about what's the best political system, what is the best way to live, what are our obligations to others, and so forth. So if we think that being rational, the prime sense, the primary meaning of rational is to describe those beliefs which we think are right and are true, that's going to make rationality a very small thing, and I think we could only claim a relatively small number of mainly scientific truths as genuinely rational. However, if we see being rational as this process, this way in which we think things through, we can recognize that it has a much bigger power, it has a bigger scope, because it's something we can all engage in. How can it be, though, that this is the case? I've just said so far, I haven't fulfilled my promise of giving you an argument. I've kind of said to you that reason is a process we all share. The problem is that, as we know, people disagree very much about what ultimately it means to be rational. How can it be, then, that we can have a shared sense of reason and rationality, and yet, at the same time, enormous disagreement about what it means to be rational? Well, I think in general terms, this is because it's not specific to reason. In order to disagree about specifics, it is often necessary that we can agree about generalities. Just a small example. Take a question like, what is democracy? What is democracy? Clearly, if we debate that, we can have all sorts of disagreements about what a properly democratic system requires, whether it requires just voting every 3 or 4 years, or whether it involves active participation. But then how can it be that people can even enter into a debate in the first place about what democracy is if they have these different answers? Well, it's obvious, really. There is a general sense, a general understanding of what democracy is, which anyone who wants to push that question further can kind of agree on. And it may be actually hard to define, because the moment you start to give it a definition, I mean, in the case of democracy, you might say just government for the people, by the people, you start entering in specifics. But it's something that just as a competent user of a language, we all have a feeling in general terms for what democracy is. Now, I think reason is similar. There are differences about what people ultimately think rationality requires. But I think it's very important that when we debate those differences, which we must do, we don't forget that they depend upon some kind of shared idea of what reason is. And let me just give an example of how this can be a case. It's a slightly technical one. There's something called the principle of bivalence, which is important in logic, theory of knowledge in philosophy. This states that for any proposition, for any statement, it must be true or false. It cannot be both, or it cannot be neither. Now, this principle, there are people who would say that this principle is absolutely central to good, clear, logical thought. Okay? But the point is, at the same time, they have to argue that position. Okay? They have to argue that position against people who, using reason, disagree. People who argue for the existence of what are called fuzzy logics, which state, bizarre though it might sound, that there are some statements which could be, say, 40% true and 60% false. I don't quite understand that myself, but then again, I'm assured this is good stuff, even if it's not ultimately right. So we can have these disagreements about what rationality ultimately requires, only because the parties that disagree can agree in general terms about what it means to enter into a reasoned debate. They have a shared idea in broad terms of what the process of rationally thinking things through entails. Well, what does that entail? I can't specify it in great detail, but there are a few things I think I'd like to identify here. The first is that I've used the noun reason. There's the verb reason, but there's also the noun reasons. To argue rationally is first and foremost to provide reasons for your position, not just to say, this is true because I said so, this is true, and you just have to believe me. Now, of course, not all reasons count, but the kind of reasons which are important in debating rationally have two very basic characteristics. They are accessible to other people, and they are accessible by other people. In other words, Everyone can look at them for themselves and they can test using either just power of thought or experiment or observation whether they are true. This is why it's not rational to say, this is true because I feel it in my soul. I feel it in my soul. That's not something that you can examine for yourself to see whether that's the case or whether that's a good reason. I'm appealing to something entirely private. I need to say this is true because, and then either present to you an argument you can examine or point to some evidence that you can examine, something that's we're all able to assess. Now, I want to give an example of this, actually, which is important in terms of debates we're having about religion, which I think are rumbling along in the background and sometimes in the foreground of this debate, this weekend. What about if someone says, I believe this to be true because the Bible says so? Is that person engaging in a rational debate in the way that I've defined rationality? Well, I think it depends. If the person says because the Bible says so, full stop, end of story, they're not prepared to defend that, they're not prepared to explain why that's a good reason, then that's no good, that's not rational debate. But if they are prepared to give reasons why it is the Bible is a good source of knowledge and so forth, they are entering the arena of rational debate. It doesn't mean they're right, of course. It doesn't mean that ultimately their reasons stand up to scrutiny. But I think it's really important, in order for us to create a public space, a civic space in which we can all debate together these big issues, it's very important that even when we think someone's conclusions are fundamentally irrational, that we allow the fact that if they are prepared to give their reasons and argue them forward in a public way, that they have entered the realm of public reason. We need that shared space in order for there to be proper dialogue and so forth. Now, you might think this is just far too permissive. I'm letting too much in. If even someone who says because the Bible says so can be engaging in rational debate, then haven't I just made rationality far too thin? I don't think so. Now, there's a simple reason for this. The metaphor I'd use is this, that a game can be easy to play, but it can be difficult to win. And that is exactly the case with rational argument. I think that in order to, I have allowed the fact that someone who wants to cite the Bible as an authority can enter the arena of rational debate if they're prepared to provide reasons. That does not for 1 minute suggest that I think that we should accept as just shrug our shoulders when they come to what seems to be the wrong conclusion. Because when we assess their reasons, we see they're not good reasons. Okay? And that's the really important thing. And it goes back to the distinction I was making earlier about rational as a label we attach to successful arguments, successful conclusions which we know to be true, and rationality as a process. I think it's really important that we cherish and treasure and promote this idea of reason as a shared capacity, that's something that even people we profoundly disagree with can sincerely engage with. I think it's important because it's, if not on the one hand, if we simply abandon reason or claim that reason is just something to be debunked, like the critics did, then what are we left with? We're just left with dogmatic assertion. And dogmatic assertion is a dangerous thing. So at the very least, even if you think my conception of reason here is very thin, at the very least it rules out dogmatic assertion, and it's important we do rule it out. On the other hand, if we make reason too specific, if we make it too much tied up to our particular worldview, we simply cut off the possibility of reasoned debate with other people, which is a political as well as a philosophical problem, of course, because we live in an increasingly interconnected world where people take very different positions, and we need to find spaces in which we can argue out those big disagreements. So this is why the image that comes to mind when I think of reason is that reason is the thin ice upon which serious thought skates. It's thin for various reasons. It's thin because there always are personal desires, motivations, and prejudices which are threatening to break through and destroy it. There's also power, superstition, received opinion, which again is always threatening to fracture it and can break through. But it's also thin because I think the idea itself resists too thick, too specific a specification. It's a difficult thing. We all know what reason is in broad enough terms that we can use it and that we can share it. But actually try and explain what is, and try and justify it. Try and give a philosophical argument as to why we should trust reason. Then you end up arguing in circles. You can only use reason to justify reason. In that sense, it rests upon itself. That again makes it a thin, fragile thing. So I think the thing about reason and rationality is that it is precious as much for its fragility as for its strength. And we need to recognize that. And if we truly want to proudly champion reason, I think it's very important that we are properly modest about what it is and what it can achieve. Thank you very much.